my main contention is that we are not at a time in history where we should be making a choice which is either or, of these two. We should not be having to choose. We should leverage what we have as an immense resource of historical cities that go back to thousands of years in some cases. And to leverage that along with a very judicious use of what is now a very scarce resource, which is land, and a judicious use of that for greenfield cities. We need both. The reason why you must plan faster and really get into this quickly, dive into it, use Gati Shakti, use all the stuff at our disposal, use the National Commission for Urbanization, is that we need to get this done fast. China managed to move its population from a certain level of prosperity to a much higher level of prosperity because it did the urbanization fast.
We have Jagan Shah today, the CEO of the Infravision Foundation, and I think one of India's finest urban experts, talking to us. It couldn't be at a better time, Jagan. I think our cities seem to be drowning. Either they're drowning or they're overcrowded, or new metros are being flooded. People are being choked. I mean, everywhere you look, there's a story of urban chaos. And I was very struck by the article you wrote today in the Hindustan Times, which talked about the need for a national urban plan. And there were so many thoughts there. But I'd like to begin by really talking to you about the idea of the greenfield city versus the brownfield city. And so much of thought has gone into both. And we've seen examples of successes and failures of both. So talk to us about this idea that you mooted, that we need to have a plan which looks at both in a holistic perspective.
Thanks, Kaveree, first of all, and thanks very much for inviting me to have this conversation. It's
something that you enjoy, I think.
It's heartening to know that somebody's reading, that op-ed piece, but that's, interesting sort of question that you've asked. I think in terms of greenfield urbanization per se, there's a kind of a mixed history to it. It originates both in terms of early 20th century concepts about escaping from the industrial city and creating what in the American context became suburbs, which is a post-Second World War phenomenon. But the idea had been conceived much earlier. These were all escapes from industrial, old cities that had been ruined almost by pollution from industries and whatnot in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So it has historically a long history. But having said that, what is really important is that in the Indian context, the greenfield city is something which in some senses is almost like a ubiquitous thing, because the armed forces have been creating cantonments, which are greenfield cities. The growth of the large hydroelectric dam projects, industrial townships, Rourkela, Jamshedpur famously, all of these are cities that grew up around industrial growth drivers. And these were greenfield because those industries didn't exist there before. So we've had a long history of actually building greenfield cities. What is fundamentally a shift that has taken place, of course, is after 2013, when the new land acquisition policy was brought in. The acquisition of land, which is a prerequisite or a precondition to the development of greenfield cities, has become a lot more difficult in the sense of the need for farmers to be, in a sense, far more involved in the process. Whereas our land markets have been driven a lot by the profiteering from land, which is, is sort of a large driver in itself. which manifests itself in things like real estate, but not just. A lot of it goes into infrastructure development. So what we've got is a situation where we have a tendency to favor the greenfield because that is making new things. As you said very well, the existing cities are crumbling, and they seem to be. And there is, as a result of this, what I call the ambivalence between, the greenfield and the brownfield. Now, the brownfield has another history altogether. It has, the history of urban renewal attached to it, which again originates in the early 20th century, and interestingly, in cities like London, was associated with real estate developers like John Nash, who actually created Regent's Crescent and Regent's Park and all of these new developments in London, which cleared slums to build.
Right.
And he actually cleared slums to build Regent's Park. Now that so-called urban renewal is something that is pertaining to the brownfield, where there is a historical city and you actually refashion it, you do a kind of surgery on it. Now, my main contention is that we are not at a time in history where we should be making a choice which is either or, of these two. We should not be having to choose. We should leverage what we have as an immense resource of historical cities that go back to thousands of years, in some cases. And to leverage that along with a very judicious use of what is now a very scarce resource, which is land, and a judicious use of that for greenfield cities. We need both. There is no doubt about that, because we are growing. And what I also say in my article is that our growth is not planned well enough. And that's really my basic sort of premise for the article, which is, heck, let's start putting more weight behind the planning. And it's not as if the government of India isn't alert to this, because the Niti Aayog produced a very, very important report on the state of the planning profession, and the need for us to promote planning at a much larger scale across the country, which basically means that we have to replace dogmas of early 20th century planning and replace them with more current models of both creative redevelopment of the brownfield and expansion that is done through greenfield cities. So, essentially my attempt was to kind of try and illustrate what kind of a scenario we are dealing with, and frankly speaking, in a free market economy, it shouldn't be about choosing one or the other. It should be about what local stakeholders, villagers who give land, investors who invest in that land, what they need as a model. Either an extension of an existing city or a completely separate, township.
Again, there's so many ideas in that, short statement, which lend themselves to complete separate conversations as well. But I want to pick up on the Niti Aayog. It recently also said that we need to reevaluate what urban is, and it's talked about these 4 pilot projects. So what exactly is going on in terms of the thinking around this idea of urban planning, re-looking at this at the level of the government?
Well, I think it's a very important initiative that is being picked up by the Niti Aayog and championed by the Niti Aayog, which is to promote the idea that cities are growth hubs. I mean,
right.
I might even say that that is, urbanization 101, because cities are growth hubs. I mean, we are saying they're drivers of our growth, so they're growth hubs. But I think the attempt here is more to discover the method by which the economic planning of a region around a city, many cities themselves form very large regions because of urban agglomeration, how to leverage that for economic productivity, right? So to produce more wealth, essentially, because that is what will in a sense, drive your urbanization strategy as well. So to me, that's an important aspect, and I do mention the growth hubs, promotion of growth hubs, right in the beginning of my article, because these are foundational ideas. Now, they're not. But having said that, they are not earth-shaking, new ideas. They're the Regional Planning Association that plans New York, has been doing it since almost 100 years. I think more than 100 years. So it's not completely new as an idea. The idea has to be given an Indian a method that works for the Indian system. It has to be given an Indian form, and how that economic planning should be done, which currently is not done, for instance, right? Today, we just use land use regulations as a form of planning. We don't really do an economic plan for a city. We have tried doing city development plans under JNURM. We're preparing plans of various kinds, but the kind of planning that Niti Aayog is promoting is investment planning. So again, all of this can be done well, but it needs a number of different conditions to proceed. Yeah, and I think one of those conditions is something that I hope will be addressed if people are animated by this idea that we should be doing much more of this national level view. But even if you pick up at a state level, imagine that we are doing a growth hub plan for Surat, right? Which is great. We should do it for Surat. But close to Surat, there is a city called Valsad. There is a city called Bharuch. There is a city called Vadodara. There is Bilimora. There's Vapi. There's, at a arm's length, there is Bombay. So what are we talking about in the, so what is the growth hub, and what is its scale, and how does it interact with other growth hubs, right? Because each one of these are growth hubs. They may or may not have the investment in industry that Surat might invite, or the investment in certain kinds of economic activities that different cities invite. But having said that, they are competitors, because we're talking about competitive, cooperative and competitive sort of national development. So those are the missing pieces that I'm trying to kind of point to by saying that great that we're thinking about growth hubs, but let's not wait to then start thinking about how all those growth hubs aggregate at a national level or even at a state level.
And it's interesting, you talked about that these ideas are not new. You also mentioned the National Commission on Urbanization of 1985, which I think very few people know about. And I think have read the document, I presume, that has been produced. So talk a little about what were the ideas there, and could they very well just be adapted to the problems we have now?
As somebody trained as an architect, I would say that at a conceptual level, what you do with an individual house plot, the level to which you plan and the level to which you extract value out of every rupee that you spend on that, that's a fairly ubiquitous skill, by the way, in India, right? I mean, every homeowner who builds a house of their own actually puts in that level of rigor into it. Now, we don't usually exercise the same rigor when we spend public funds for making greenfield cities. So, sorry to interrupt there, Jagan, but there's also now this idea which Nandan Nilekani has floated, that the home itself can become an economic unit. It's powering its energy through solar, through the sun. It's composting its own waste. It's producing its own water. So in a way, your home is becoming a little city, a little township. Exactly. And that's precisely the kind of innovative thinking that we need to bring to the table. And start doing this thinking at a national level, right? I mean, we need that. So if the future should be about those individual homes, which, by the way, our foundation has, for instance, contributed to the rooftop solar scheme, right? And yes, exactly. What is that? That is recognizing that every home can be a productive unit, not just in in terms of an agri-economy, but also in terms of energy production, right?
Right.
Now you could. So these are economies of scale. These are economies of agglomeration effects. Now economists know about this. This is for them like very trivial almost. But having said that, we need to bring that thinking into thinking about how these systems of cities work. I remember, in fact, when I was director in IUA in 2013, my first year there, I had the happy opportunity of attending a meeting chaired by Arun Maira when he was at the Planning Commission, and
who's also who's also part of our Council of Advisors.
Yes, thankfully. And Arun Maira asked the question of the room full of so-called urban experts, all of us pretending to be, and he said, "Okay, could anybody explain to me what is the system by which all our cities work together? You know, what unites all of this? Like, how come we are in peaceful coexistence with the neighboring town and so on? You know, what is the system? What is the system?" And the National Commission on Urbanization, for the first time in some fundamental sense, took a deep as well as a broad view of what are those systems that unite all our urban systems. Right. So they talked about shelter. They talked about how we construct buildings. They even imagined in 1985, which is quite remarkable, you know, how because Charles Correa was the chairman and he's an architect. He was an architect, and they even imagined what the construction technology ought to be. And they talk about steel construction and high-rise construction. But they conclude that we neither have the steel nor the skills for doing it. So to go back to your question about, you know, can that form a ready base? I believe that, you know, I call it the genealogy of ideas. I mean, almost everything we talk about today in the urban sector has been presaged by the established experts were young people who worked on that in 1985, you know, a lot of them. So it's a very interesting thing because it kind of represents a starting point in some sense of a lot of thinking about cities and urbanization in the country. But it has, in a sense, not converted into a national level plan as it should have done.
Right. You know, I've always wondered, because having visited some of these cities as well, like Naya Raipur and, Ambi Valley, and you talk about why these ideas on paper looked wonderful. I mean, they were contiguous to bigger cities, they were new developments. Why did they not work? What was the issue? Why did these greenfield cities or mini cities not work? And in fact, I love the description that you have. Why have they become desolate landscapes of unfulfilled desire? God, that's so depressing. But they are.
I felt depressed when I went to Naya Raipur last, which was 2 years ago. But I did feel depressed. I mean, that depressed about the lost opportunity. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what this also highlights for us, and I'm not going to try and figure out what went wrong, because that's there could be a host of reasons. I think fundamentally what went wrong is that the exuberance about selling a gated experience of being urban and yet being in the lap of nature, or being urban and yet being cut away from economic activities such as in Naya Raipur. The administrative capital, we can recreate Chandigarh. Some of these ideas were simply not tested against the merits of doing something of that kind, the merits of greenfield options, where you could have created maybe an administrative satellite to Raipur without having to say, hey, we are building a whole city, right? So I think this is again the point about ambivalence, and we're not able to make a clear understanding of whether we need brownfield or we need greenfield. We're constantly waffling between the two. But having said that, I think what is really important is that these kinds of examples, and especially because one of them is a sort of chosen administrative capital of a state, also point to the lingering and unfortunately something which has a long tail of socialist era, national scale kind of decision making, right? So it's this idea that you can engineer a certain reality. Now, the problem is that cities take even the Indian government would expect that a new city will take about 40 to 50 years to come up, right? Now, it's impossible to tell what's going to happen. The risks attached to a 40, 50-year timeline, those risks are enormous if you look at it from an economic perspective, but if you look at it from a speculation perspective, those risks are fairly low, because it's quite likely that in 40, 50 years, your piece of land that you've just bought in that future will pay dividends. Of course, usually they pay dividends within the first year. Now, the point is that we can't be driving our economic growth narrative through an urbanization which is fairly sort of what one might say fairly banal, right? Which is about artificially trying to create land value rather than recognizing that actually you could be investing the same effort and the same amount of time and so on. So these are all lost opportunities, and therefore they tend to really quieten the spirits, when you look at them or experience them. So I think the key thing is ultimately that what are you building for? I can't predict whether the city is going to be fully populated, productive economically in 40, 50 years. Will it actually produce the jobs I'm promising to? Now, as a country, as a nation, we can't be leaving things to chance like this, because what is at stake is prosperity that can be shared by 1.5 billion people. So you can't be doing this, and that's really what I'm trying to sort of highlight, which is that it's not a technical issue. This is actually a political issue or a constitutional issue, which is can we simply, because we are a federation and therefore and land is a subject under the state, that we shouldn't be having a conversation about a national plan? I don't believe so. I believe for achieving that developed country by 2047 dream, you cannot be balkanizing the conversation on urbanization planning.
Speaking of the Constitution, I mean, the 74th Amendment is perhaps one that is talked about so often, but never actually implemented fully or never actually carefully looked at. Mm-hmm. Whereas we've seen that the 73rd Amendment has actually changed the face of, rural governance. The same has not happened in urban areas. That is something that has actually ceased to be part of the conversation. Or if it is, perhaps one doesn't read or hear about it so much. Would you agree?
Oh gosh, this is always one of I guess keeps a lot of people awake at night as well. Sometimes thinking about will we see the 74th Amendment fully?
Because they've seen that change is possible, and it has happened to a large extent.
I think, Kaveree, we need to stop being comforted by a few good things, right? We need to understand that, we're always giving ourselves consolation prizes. I think we should stop doing that, and go for the grand prize, because the grand prize is huge, right? I think the 74th Amendment, what is it fundamentally? It's about decentralization, devolution, independence. It is fundamentally about the independence of cities, the autonomy of cities. Now, autonomy does not mean that it is, challenging the next higher level, which is the state. Autonomy is, if you see it from a functional perspective, that autonomy is necessary. You've got to be able to account for your budgets. You should be able to spend, as much as you can sustain, and therefore and this is again another reason why this has to be a larger public debate. There needs to be greater conversation about this. A 74th Amendment implemented through bureaucratic process is no amendment at all. It is no reform. What is needed is the championing of local self-government, and that that's the department. LSG is still the department that is relevant in many states. It's even called that. The importance of local self-government. Now, you cannot be having multiple systems operating at the same time. And K.C. Sivaramakrishnan, God bless his soul, who was one of our main thinkers, former president of CPR, one of our main thinkers on the subject of decentralization. He found many travesties within the way in which we are governing our cities. Now, that's not going to change until the public demands that it change. If the public doesn't care whether there is a municipal councillor who has been elected or not, or whether the municipal council has been elected for several years, sometimes a decade, then you're not going to get decentralization. Then you will be at the mercy of decisions being taken at a much higher level, right? And therefore, those decisions will be that much distanced from your reality. And that's why it matters. It should matter to the public. I know that Janagra, for instance, has been sort of thinking about, how do we understand the relationship between national level politics and local level politics, right? Because if local politics, which is about basic services, which is about law and order, which is about access to public facilities and so on, and open spaces, if that discourse is going to be dominated by national level politics and party politics, then you have again a travesty of local self-government. Local self-government should ideally be protected, or ideally not be indulging in national level politics. It is, except to the extent of sharing best practices. That's about it. But it is completely under the sway of, much larger scale issues which don't pertain to the local. It's like that, and I think there's the time has come that there is now an imperative that we bring all this together. It's a bit like Humpty Dumpty is broken, and we're not able to put this together. Between devolution, decentralization narratives to investment and growth narratives, which tend to work almost in parallel and don't talk to each other so much, and the narrative of jobs and employment and so on, as well as the social narrative of an aging population soon. All of this needs to be thought of together. But now, how else will you do it if you don't take an overall purview? To start with, even at the state level, nobody's doing it, right? I mean, so let alone at the national level. But I believe it is the national government that has the obligation to convert everybody to that path and of convergence on this. Because frankly speaking, if you were to sit with the map of India and you started actually tracing out the lines of industrial growth, and if you put all that data together, which is what I hope is available to us soon through the Gati Shakti platform, which I mentioned, then that picture that emerges from that, if you're able to, if you can read, in a sense, between the plans, then that will inform better decisions. It's as simple as that. We are not taking stock of the complexity of what we're dealing with, but we must do it because we have a duty of care.
And in fact, you mentioned that there's no better time than now to do this. You mentioned the Gati Shakti platform. You mentioned the rise of greenfield and brown, and something very interesting. I love that term, the aerotropolis. The growth of these aerotropolises, which I have not heard before or read before. And some of these you say, and they are quite successful or seem to be quite successful, like Jawar and Navi Mumbai. So you seem to suggest that there's, everything is right about the time for this conversation to really take off.
No, certainly. I mean, I think it's not just Jewar. And frankly speaking, I'm not a soothsayer. I don't know whether it will succeed, the Aerotropolis
Yeah.
around Jaber.
The land
Who
values are
knows?
certainly rising.
Yes, but people might just sit on their haunches and sort of wait for it all to, you know what I'm saying, because people are investing in multiple plots of land and multiple properties, one way or the other. We don't know how that will turn out, but it's likely to turn out in a certain way. I hope it is planned. That's all. I think the idea of the Aerotropolis is only one of a bunch of different ways I tried to describe what generates. Three cities generated by a different kind of generative logic. Javer is generated, or the Aerotropolis is generated by a different logic, and so on. So ultimately, we are talking about, so cities are economic drivers, but cities have economic drivers as well, right? So in most cases, historically, cities have grown around trade routes, in ancient India, religious, circuits. They've existed for hundreds of years. Let's not forget that. Pilgrimage is actually, very few people know, for instance, that one of the first plans made for the city of Rome was actually for pilgrims. It was for pilgrims, Rome didn't become the center of the Roman Empire only because of military might. It was also, the Holy See and so on. And we need to recognize that each city has an economic driver, and each one has the potential to become a much more prosperous or larger city, or the potential to make the choice to remain small. And I think there's an innocuous line in my article, which actually I had also kind of not, I reread it and I discovered that there's something interesting there, which is that, and that's where the 74th Amendment argument is buried in my article, unfortunately buried, is that this point about it's for the city to decide whether it wants to sponsor a satellite of, for itself, or it wants to simply get denser, right? It's for the city to decide.
Or whether it wants to, sorry, I missed that. Whether it wants
become
to
denser, if it wants to go higher,
right.
Maybe it wants to become an island of prosperity, or it wants to engender another satellite of prosperity, or whatever. It should be the city that decides these things. Today, we follow this national sort of planning approach, trying to mix it with market, approaches by not making our cities self-sufficient or accounting for themselves, and feeding them through this kind of drip line of grants and whatnot. And at the same time, we want to decide what they should become as well. So, we've got to step back from that. Now, the important thing here, Kaveree, is I think, because somewhere lurking behind all of these models and dogmas that we are talking about is, hey, can't we repeat the Chinese success model, right?
Yeah, I think everyone has that argument.
Everybody has that kind of, it's can't we do what they did? Actually, they're not the only ones who did it. A lot of people have tried to do it, but the Chinese did it very well. They did it very well because they did it fast. And I think the underlying idea here for me as well is that the reason why you must plan faster and really get into this quickly, dive into it, use Gati Shakti, use all the stuff at our disposal, use the National Commission for Urbanization, is that we need to get this done fast. China managed to move its population from a certain level of prosperity to a much higher level of prosperity because it did the urbanization fast, right? Yes, it has some ghost towns. Yes, it has some of that. We don't know fully about what the destiny of all of that will be. But having said that, they moved farmers, encouraged people to move into cities, they created manufacturing clusters, but they upgraded quality of life for everybody, right? Now, we're not able to do all of that. And therefore it's got to be a national project. You've got to get everybody galvanized around, hey, let's go for this. here's a national plan. This is where growth is going to be. This is where food is going to be grown. This is where, we've got to be able to do this. Now, the fact that we think we can't do it is, to me, somewhat ridiculous, because your technologies today allow you to do things that even China could not have access to, when it started urbanizing around the Pearl River Delta, and that's the story that led to Shenzhen and, all of this. So you've got to get into this fast and do it fast. You can't sort of, and that's the tragedy of it all, which is that we did this exercise in 85, we didn't convert it as such into action, and then here we are in 2025, and we still don't seem to be interested in sitting down and making a plan. And that's why I use the analogy of somebody building a 80 square yard plot house. The amount of effort that person is going to put into buying that brick and making it, build a good wall. Why don't we do that with our urbanization strategy? Why aren't we treating it with the same level of care and attention? To me, I think it's an application of a responsibility, because, as I said, we have a duty of care to the Indian people, who need far more planning as evidence of the investment of effort that is required. As evidence that we are investing more effort into treating our economic and social goals, development goals, with greater seriousness. And to me, this is a serious effort that is needed. And I guess the sooner it gets done, the better.
There's so many other questions, but I think we'll leave it for another discussion. But I think the point you've made about making it a national project is something that the Infravision Foundation would like to contribute to, make, keeping it part of the national conversation and hoping that it somehow becomes a reality. Urbanization becomes as vital. Urban planning becomes a vital part of our conversation. I think we've been working towards that, and you've bbeen working towards that. So thank you so much, Jagan, and I hope this is the first of several conversations we'll do around this issue. As you know better how we're working towards UMTA as an idea as well as a reality. So we'll do much more of this. Thank you so much for your time.